Well, good morning, YouTube world. It's a hazy, cold morning here in New England, early December. A bit noisy, as you can hear, the generator's running. A bit quiet. There's just me and one or two other boats left in the harbor, still off grid. Still hoping to score one more cruise before I have to throw in the towel for the season and go in and plug in. I thought I'd talk a little bit about what it is that draws the line in the sand for me and brings about the need to call it quits for the year and leave the mooring, head for the dock. In my case, the dock means stripping the sails and essentially securing the boat for the winter storms with about 14 dock lines and shore power cords. Essentially, it gets to a point where it's just too much of a task to leave the slip for a short sail or even for a 2 or 3 day cruise. So we go into winter mode. Last year it was January 8th when I finally had to pull the plug and make that decision. But each year it's a little bit of a personal challenge to see how late into the season I can cruise. I've not seen Hadley's Harbor in February yet, but that's the Ultima Thule. At some point that will happen. So the last few videos I've posted have talked a little bit about heating systems and what it is I do to keep Charis warm. I thought I'd talk a little bit today about what it is that finally makes the tipping point between living off-grid and being plugged in defined. And the real issue for me is how many days or how much period of time we will have at far below freezing temperatures. Generally speaking, in the fall, the water temperature stays warm here in New England quite late. I monitor that with an indoor-outdoor remote thermometer hanging in the bilge, as well as a data recording set of thermometers that I have in the bilge and in the engine compartment in various places around the boat, so I can track temperature trends. Now the big thing is, obviously you don't want to get to a point where your water tanks and your water lines and hoses freeze. As long as the seawater temperature remains above freezing, the possibility of that is fairly remote. But at some point in the January-February time frame, the seawater temperature is going to get to or below freshwater freezing point. Seawater doesn't freeze until about 30 degrees Fahrenheit, but obviously freshwater 32 is the limit. So right now our seawater temperatures are showing in the low 40s, between 40 and 44 degrees. And that means that the water tanks are fairly safe, even if, as the forecast shows, it goes down to approximately 14 degrees tonight. I'm pretty confident that the bilge hoses, the water pump, and the tanks will be okay. As you move aft in the boat, though, things are a bit more of a concern, and that's why you hear the generator running this morning. Let me explain. So here's Charis's engine bay. Hanging in the back corner there in that little blue waterproof box is one of my temperature data loggers, recording temperature. But the issue of critical importance back here is my water heater. Let's just see it back in the corner here. The water heater is just around the water line, so it does benefit somewhat from the seawater temperature being warmer than the air temperature. However, there's a very real possibility with temperatures going much below 30 that the water heater could freeze. If the water heater freezes and splits, the cost of a new water heater is only the beginning of the tragedy, because the only way to get this water heater in or out is to remove the engine. So needless to say, I am hyper vigilant about preventing the water heater from dropping below freezing and destroying itself. To that end, the water heater temperature is monitored under this pipe insulation right here. Is the probe from an indoor-outdoor thermometer, which is located right here. As you can see, it's up to about 64 degrees right now. It was probably around 42 degrees earlier before I started the generator. Now the water heater is well insulated, and if I get it up to temperature, I think it's probably about 160 degree cutoff on the electric element. Once it's up to temperature, the water heater will stay hot for quite some time. It'll certainly drop slowly in temperature. So the goal here, when I know I'm going into a sub-freezing temperature time period, is to get the water heater elevated all the way to full temperature. And that is denoted on the indoor-outdoor thermometer by a reading of about 120 degrees Fahrenheit, because the probe is outside of the tank. It's on a metal pipe that loses a little bit of heat as the pipe comes out of the tank. So when I see that I'm at somewhere 110 to 120 degrees on my thermometer, I know that my water heater has reached pretty much full operating temperature. At that point, I can be relatively sure that it will hold enough heat not to freeze for at least a 24-hour period. So there are two ways that I can heat the water in my water heater, either electrically, and I have opted for a 500 watt electric element in this water heater. I did that starting many years ago when I decided that I wanted to be able to use a 1000 watt inverter generator. I talked a little bit about that in the video I did on the generator, but essentially that smaller generator is less than half the weight of the generator I would need to run the normal conventional 1500 watt element. Now that comes with a trade-off. If you do the math on heating water, a 500 watt element such as I have, in order to raise the temperature of the water, let's say 5 gallons in that tank, to raise that temperature from where I started this morning at say 40 degrees Fahrenheit up to the cutoff point of about 160 Fahrenheit in the tank, the theoretical time that it would take 500 watts to do that is about 3 hours. So if you want to work in round rough numbers, you could say that you gain about 40 degrees Fahrenheit per hour of 500 watt energy. The other way to heat water in the tank is by running the main engine and using waste heat from the engine. That's a really sort of uneconomical way of doing things, particularly if you're running it idle. Diesel engines don't really heat up until you put them under a load. So running the engine at idle, first of all, it's not great, particularly for a mechanical diesel like I have. I know that some of the new electronically injected common rail engines are better able to handle idling, but it's not great for any diesel engine to run for extended periods under no load. So I try and avoid that. Unless I'm using the engine to push the boat, it's really not my primary means of water heat or charging. But it's there as an option. And truth be told, I may run the engine this evening before we drop down to 15 Fahrenheit, just to put some heat in the block and run some heat through the heat exchanger and get everything in there as warm as I can before the temperature crashes overnight. Of course, all of this discussion about keeping the water heater from freezing is pertinent only to my off-grid existence. Once I'm at the dock and plugged in, that 500 watt heating element just runs from the main shore power panel here, and thermostatically keeps the water heater at temperature and prevents it from freezing. At that point, another reason why I typically decommission the boat for the winter is that I will also get all the salt water out of the engine heat exchanger, drain all of that, and replace it with non-toxic antifreeze, so I don't really have to worry about the main engine at that point either. When I'm in the dock and plugged in, what I'll do is use essentially a 100 watt light bulb in the bilge. That placed under the engine and right next to the fresh water pump is, generally speaking, enough to keep those warm enough not to freeze. That's my on-grid mode. So down here in Charis's deep keel bilge, I'll be talking about this more in a later video about what I do to obtain and keep fresh water on Charis throughout the year. But these are two 20-ish gallon Monell water tanks, and not only do I protect these with my life, Monell is probably the ultimate material to store your fresh water in, and as you can probably tell by panning out a bit here, if I had to change these water tanks, it would be a major disaster. The entire main cabin of the boat would have to be ripped out. So keeping these tanks from freezing is a high priority. To that end, I'm pretty vigilant in the winter, and what I'll normally do is drop these tanks down to a lower level once I've decided that there's a risk of them freezing, once the seawater temperature is starting to hover around the freezing point. So I'll drop these down to a low enough level that if the water in them froze, it would have some place to expand without bursting the tank. And at that point, I begin using my forward two tanks, the fill for one being there in the head, the fill for the other being under the bunk in the forward cabin. Those are flexible bladder tanks, and not that I want them to burst, but frankly they're less likely to burst because they're flexible, and if they did, they're both very easily removed and replaced. So keeping these tanks from freezing is a major priority. I have been working on a sort of an add-on to the toolbox heater that can essentially duct some of the toolbox heater's hot air down into the bilge through the hatch over the fresh water pump, and I'll show that in a later video. That's still a work in progress. So I'll admit that I've had some ideas about how I might otherwise heat the water heater than with the generator and the engine. Various ideas about using the propane water heater to circulate through. It would certainly be much faster, that being a very high BTU output. It would be quieter, but admittedly the complication of teeing into the hot water lines or the engine coolant lines has left me without a real clear path or understanding of how I'd make that all work. Anyway, just a teaser. It's sort of swirling around in the back of my mind, and could be coming soon to a Rube Goldberg boat near you. So there you have it. That's this morning's musing. Thought I would share a little bit, now that I've shared some of how I heat the boat, with what draws the limit to my cruising season here in New England. And obviously this would be different in different circumstances. If my winter berth were easy to get in and out of, I could certainly stay commissioned year-round, but I'm very fortunate in the place that I do have for the winter, and certainly it's not a big price to pay to need to decommission the boat for a month or two. And truth be told, when you get to this part of the season, and this year has been particularly true of this, the number of days that you get where it is advantageous or even possible to sail where you want to go are few and far between. You've got to kind of look down the road and say, if I head to Hadley's today, am I going to get a break in the gale conditions out of the northwest to come back without beating to weather and having a really bad trip? You tend to be a bit more picky about your weather windows, and you have to be very time flexible in the windows that you have to take advantage of. That gets to be a little trickier on the holidays. There's lots going on and lots of outside expectations, so it can be tough to get a break to cruise in New England in November and December and even January. On the flip side of that, it's just incredibly beautiful, and you've got the whole place to yourself wherever you go. So big challenges, but bigger rewards. And I think to some degree people think you're nuts if you're still on a mooring, in New England in December. If you're still sailing in January, they really think there's something wrong with you. But then again, the fact that you get to Hadley's Harbor and those people aren't there really kind of explains to you why maybe they just don't see the other side of it. So anyway, thanks for coming aboard this week, and hope that sort of answers some questions about the limitations of high season or high latitude late season sailing. Please like and subscribe, and feel free to throw comments and suggestions and turn this into a conversation.